Welcome. You're about to listen to an extended narration designed for deep relaxation, gentle curiosity, and perhaps even sleep. In this episode, we will explore in great and soothing detail the bureaucratic and historical development of the Indian Railways. Please relax and allow your mind to drift as we begin. 1853, the first train from Bombay to Thane. The history of Indian Railways began on the 16th of April, 1853. At precisely 3:35 p.m., the first official passenger train departed from Boribunda in Bombay, traveling a distance of 34 kilometers to Thane. The train was pulled by three steam locomotives named Sultan, Sindh, and Sahib. It consisted of 14 carriages and carried approximately 400 passengers. The journey took about 57 minutes. This inaugural train was not a spontaneous event. It was the result of prolonged deliberations among British colonial officials, feasibility assessments, and lengthy documentation submitted to the Court of Directors of the East India Company. The decision to begin the line in Bombay was influenced by the port's significance in trade and military logistics. Engineers were dispatched from the United Kingdom, while contracts for rail lines were issued to British manufacturers. The gauge selected was the broad gauge of 5 feet 6 inches, primarily to ensure stability and compatibility with heavier locomotives. The British believed that railways would serve multiple purposes: administrative control, troop movement, and the efficient extraction of raw materials. Every aspect of the railway's launch, from ticket pricing to station design, was debated in a series of official circulars now archived in the India Office records in London. The success of the Bombay-Thane line led to the establishment of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway Company. Incorporated in 1849, it was one of several private enterprises given a guarantee of 5% return by the colonial government under the terms of the railway guarantee system. Thus began the slow but inexorable spread of steel rails across the subcontinent. The role of British administrators in track laying. The expansion of the Indian railways in the mid-19th century was driven by the bureaucratic machinery of British India. Administrators based in Calcutta, Bombay, and London coordinated a wide network of engineers, surveyors, and contractors. Every proposed mile of track required detailed reports, which were reviewed by the Public Works Department and the India Office in London. The process began with a topographical survey. Teams of Indian laborers, often led by British supervisors, mapped out potential routes using basic theodolites, compasses, and measuring chains. The terrain was carefully evaluated to avoid excessive gradients or unstable soil. Once a route was selected, it underwent committee review, first locally, then provincially, and finally at the central level. Land acquisition followed, often involving negotiations with princely states, zamindars, and municipal boards. Compensation rates were calculated and documented in long tables, often requiring months of correspondence between district officers and central authorities. Track laying was executed by private contractors, but overseen by British engineers known as executive engineers or superintending engineers. These individuals were graduates of engineering colleges in England and Scotland, often with prior experience in other colonies. Every component, from rails to fish plates to ballast, was itemized in procurement orders and tracked in quarterly progress reports. The reports were bound in volumes and sent to the Secretary of State for India, where they were stored in the railway archives. By 1870, the Indian Railways had over 8,000 kilometers of track, primarily concentrated in the presidencies of Bombay, Bengal, and Madras. The expansion was methodical, deliberate, and documented in extraordinary detail. Evolution of railway gauges in India. Gauge standardization was a central concern for the Indian Railways. The British initially selected the broad gauge of 5 feet 6 inches, 1676 millimeters, believing it offered better stability for long distance and heavy load trains. However, as rail construction moved into hillier or more rural regions, cost concerns prompted the introduction of narrower gauges. By the late 19th century, the meter gauge 1000 millimeters and narrow gauge 762 millimeters and 610 millimeters were being laid extensively. The choice of gauge was determined by regional priorities. Broad gauge was used for main lines, especially those critical to commerce and military transport, while meter and narrow gauges were deployed in less strategic areas to minimize costs. This led to the development of what administrators termed a multi-gauge railway system. To accommodate this, transshipment stations were built where passengers and cargo were required to change trains. These stations often included separate platforms, warehouses, and labor teams specialized in transferring goods. A series of railway gauge committees were formed to evaluate the economic and technical consequences of this system. The 1870 and 1901 reports recommended continued use of multiple gauges with standardization limited to major lines. As of 1920, India had nearly 61,000 kilometers of railway track, of which about half was meter gauge. This patchwork system persisted until the post-independence era, when unigauge policies began to unify the network under broad gauge. The gauge debate, while technical, played a central role in shaping the logistical and operational complexity of the Indian Railways. The birth of the Railway Board. The Railway Board, a central administrative body, was formally constituted in 1905. Before its formation, the management of railways in India was fragmented between the Public Works Department and various provincial governments. This lack of unified control led to inefficiencies, inconsistent policies, and overlapping jurisdictions. The Railway Board was initially composed of a 3-member panel, including a government railway official, an officer from the Indian Civil Service, and a representative from private railway companies. The meetings were held in a modest office in Shimla, later moving to Raisina Hill in Delhi. Every decision made by the board had to be documented, reviewed, and sent to the Viceroy's Council for concurrence. Its earliest tasks included the unification of reporting systems, codifying technical standards, and drafting model agreements for private operators. The board also issued annual statistical reports detailing locomotive availability, tonnage hauled, passenger revenue, and accident frequencies. These reports often ran over 200 pages and were filed meticulously. The formation of the Railway Board marked a significant step in the centralization of railway management and laid the groundwork for a more coordinated and a methodical expansion. Station design and naming conventions. Railway station design in colonial India was shaped by functionality, climate considerations, and symbolic presence. Early stations were built using stone, with high-pitched roofs to allow heat to escape and broad platforms to accommodate large crowds. Architectural styles ranged from Gothic revival in Bombay to Indo-Saracenic in Madras. Naming conventions were equally bureaucratic. Stations were named based on the nearest town, district, or colonial administrator. In cases of redundancy, additional descriptors like junction, road, or cant for cantonment were added. Naming proposals passed through district boards and had to be approved by railway zone headquarters. Signage was standardized in both English and local languages. Fonts, placement, and color schemes were regulated by circulars from the Public Works Department. Each signboard was to be no less than 6 feet wide, mounted at a height of 7 feet, and visible from a minimum distance of 150 feet. Station layouts included separate waiting rooms for men and women and different classes of passengers. The class-based spatial hierarchy reflected broader social divisions under colonial rule. Timetables and the standardization of time. One of the lesser-known challenges of early railway operations in India was the absence of a unified time standard. Each city or region operated on its own local time, often based on the sun's position. This led to logistical complications, particularly for long-distance trains crossing multiple regions. To resolve this, Indian Standard Time (IST) was adopted in 1906 based on the 82.5 degrees east longitude line running near Allahabad. Prior to this, Bombay Time, Calcutta Time, and Madras Time each had their own official clock settings, often differing by over half an hour. Timetables were printed in multiple languages and distributed across thousands of stations. The typical timetable booklet included columns for departure, arrival, distance in miles, and train class compatibility. These booklets were updated quarterly and printed in centralized government presses. Special attention was paid to punctuality. Any train arriving more than 5 minutes late was recorded and the data compiled into monthly late arrival bulletins. Stations with poor performance were subject to administrative reviews. The effort to synchronize clocks and maintain uniform scheduling is a testament to the administrative precision pursued by the Railway Board. Ticketing policies and fare classes. The ticketing system in Indian Railways evolved into a detailed hierarchy designed to reflect both affordability and social class. Initially, there were only 3 classes: first, second, and third. First class featured cushioned seats, enclosed compartments, and service attendants. Third class was bare, with wooden benches and open windows. Tickets were printed on thick cardstock and color-coded by class. They were manually stamped with dates and stations, and each ticket had a unique serial number. Tickets were stored in locked cabinets and audited weekly. Fares were calculated by distance traveled, measured in miles. The fare tables were large, bound volumes stored in station master offices. Refunds and changes were processed through written applications, submitted in duplicate, and approved by station superintendents. In 1926, a fourth class was briefly introduced for laborers, but it was soon merged back into third. Concessions were made for soldiers, students, and religious pilgrims, each requiring identification and written authorization. Ticket clerks were trained through a formal apprenticeship, and their ledgers were inspected monthly. Lost tickets required a police report and a notarized affidavit to reissue, a process that often took weeks. Train class distinctions from first to third. Class distinctions extended beyond furs and seating. Each class had designated carriages, boarding areas, and amenities. First class passengers could access private lounges, separate ticket counters, and covered platforms. They were often the only class allowed on-board refreshments. Second class offered cushioned seating and partially enclosed carriages, but fewer services. Third class, which served the majority of passengers, had the most basic arrangements: wooden slats, no lighting, and high crowding during peak hours. Train manifests had to clearly identify the number of carriages allocated to each class. Guards and conductors maintained separate logs, and misallocation was considered a procedural violation. In 1934, official diagrams were issued showing standardized carriage interiors for each class. These diagrams were stored in zone headquarters and appended to maintenance manuals. The clear stratification of classes mirrored colonial social hierarchies and would only begin to shift post-independence with the gradual introduction of sleeper class and general unreserved compartments. Post-independence railway expansion. Following independence in 1947, the Indian Railways inherited a vast but fragmented network. Tracks of different gauges, operational policies inherited from colonial systems, and damaged infrastructure due to partition posed enormous challenges. One of the immediate concerns was re-establishing lines cut off by the creation of Pakistan. Refugee trains, guarded by military personnel, became a regular feature of the network during 1947 to 48. Administrators worked around the clock to stabilize operations and reassign personnel. The Indian government nationalized most private railways by 1951, integrating them into a unified network. This move helped standardize maintenance, safety procedures, and fare structures. Investment in rolling stock and locomotives increased dramatically during the first and second five-year plans. Workshops for locomotives and carriages were expanded in places like Chittaranjan and Perambur. Indigenous manufacturing received priority, reducing dependence on imported engines. Electrification also began to replace steam power on major routes, starting with the Bombay-Pune line. By 1960, Indian Railways had become one of the largest employers in the country, with over 1 million staff and an extensive training apparatus covering engineering, customer service, and technical operations. Zonal reorganization of 1951. To streamline management, the Indian Railways was reorganized into 6 zones in 1951: Eastern, Northern, Western, Southern, Central, and Northeastern. Each zone was headed by a general manager reporting to the Railway Board. This restructuring allowed for better allocation of resources, localized management, and region-specific improvements. Operational divisions under each zone were responsible for day-to-day logistics, such as train operations, goods movement, and station maintenance. Zones maintained their own control rooms, locomotive sheds, and training centers. Communications between zones were facilitated via dedicated railway telegraph lines and later railway-specific telephone networks. A uniform administrative hierarchy was established with designations like Divisional Railway Manager, Chief Commercial Superintendent, and Chief Engineer. Each had a defined reporting structure, and their performance was reviewed through annual performance reports. The zonal system persists today, though it has expanded to include new zones like Southeast Central and East Coast. The original structure laid down in 1951 continues to guide operational planning. Uniforms and conduct rules for train staff. Standardization extended to employee appearance and behavior. Uniforms were introduced for conductors, guards, porters, and station masters. Each rank had a specific dress code, including caps with badges, epaulets, and nameplates. The station master, a key public-facing role, wore a double-breasted coat and a peaked cap, often adorned with the emblem of the zone. Guards wore white trousers and navy jackets, while porters were issued red shirts and canvas belts. Conduct rules were codified in the Railway Servants' Conduct Rules document. These covered punctuality, passenger interaction, and behavior both on and off duty. Infractions were logged in service books, and repeated offenses could lead to disciplinary proceedings. Staff underwent training not just in operational duties, but also in public interaction. Phrases like right away and all clear were standardized commands. Every motion, from flag waving to whistle blowing, was regulated through procedural manuals. The intention was to create a workforce that was professional, dependable, and visibly authoritative to passengers. Train, numbering systems, and their updates. As the network expanded, so did the complexity of managing train identities. Early trains were named and numbered informally, but with the nationalization of the railways, a standardized numbering system was adopted. Initially, trains were assigned three-digit numbers, with the first digit indicating the zone of origin. Over time, the system expanded to four digits and eventually to five digits in 2010 to accommodate the growing number of services. For instance, long-distance superfast trains typically begin with 1, while mail or express services begin with 2. Passenger trains often have numbers beginning with 5 or 6. Special trains, such as holiday or festival services, are designated with a 0 prefix. These numbers are maintained in a centralized database managed by the Center for Railway Information Systems, CRIS. Each train number is linked to its route, stopping stations, rake composition, and schedule. Updates to train numbers are issued through Railway Board bulletins and zonal notifications. Signage, reservation systems, and digital platforms are all synchronized with these numbers for consistency. Introduction of the Rajdhani Express. In 1969, the Indian Railways launched its premier long-distance service, the Rajdhani Express, between New Delhi and Howrah. The goal was to offer high-speed, overnight connectivity between the national capital and major metropolitan cities. The Rajdhani Express trains featured fully air-conditioned coaches, prioritized track clearance, and catering included in the fare. They were designed for speed and comfort, reducing travel time significantly compared to other services. Timetables for Rajdhani trains were meticulously calculated, with minimal buffer time and pre-cleared signal routes. Each train had dedicated maintenance staff and a set of backup coaches in case of breakdowns. Seats were bookable only in advance, and onboard staff included trained attendants, catering personnel, and security. Pantry cars carried pre-cooked meals that were reheated en route, adhering to hygiene protocols laid out in service manuals. Rajdhani Express symbolized modernization and became a flagship service. Over time, other cities like Mumbai, Chennai, and Bangalore were added to the Rajdhani network. Catering services on Indian Railways. Catering on Indian trains began as a modest operation, with vendors selling tea and snacks at major stations. Over time, Indian Railways introduced official pantry cars and onboard catering to improve service on long-distance trains. By the 1970s, select express trains had dedicated kitchen staff preparing meals in transit. Menus were standardized according to class. First-class passengers received three-course meals, while second-class passengers had access to simpler boxed lunches. All pantry operations followed detailed procedural manuals. These included cleanliness standards, food temperature requirements, and approved menu lists. Food inspectors conducted random checks, and violations were logged in a central register. Contracts for pantry services were initially awarded through the zonal railways but later centralized under the Indian Railway Catering and Tourism Corporation (IRCTC). Vendors required licenses, health certificates, and quarterly inspections. Today, most Rajdhani, Shatabdi, and Duronto trains include catering services, with meals included in the fare. Pre-packed meals and IRCTC e-catering now allow passengers to order from partner restaurants en route. Sleeper class configuration, a deep dive. Sleeper class, introduced to provide affordable long-distance travel, became the backbone of Indian Railways passenger service. It evolved from the basic third-class design, offering additional comfort while maintaining low fares. Each sleeper coach typically contains 72 berths arranged in a three-tier configuration. The layout includes 6 berths per bay and 2 side berths along the aisle. Seats convert into sleeping platforms using latches and hinges. Curtains are not provided, maintaining visibility and open ventilation. Coaches are equipped with fans, openable windows, and common toilets at both ends. Older coaches use pit latrines, while newer models feature bio-toilets to reduce track pollution. Sleeper coaches also have designated charging points and emergency chains. Cleaning protocols are documented in service manuals. Staff are assigned for mid-journey cleaning, and onboard waste is collected in color-coded bins. Signage indicates do's and don'ts, often printed in multiple languages. Ticketing for sleeper class uses reserved quotas, with charts prepared at least 4 hours before departure. Unreserved passengers are not permitted, except during emergencies with official approval. Rail budget presentation rituals. For most of independent India's history, the railway budget was presented separately from the union budget. This tradition began in 1924 and continued until 2016. The railway minister would deliver the budget speech before Parliament, often highlighting new routes, coach upgrades, and fare revisions. The process leading up to the budget involved months of internal consultation. Zonal railways submitted proposals, which were compiled at the Railway Board. Financial estimates were cross-checked by the Finance Ministry and submitted to the Cabinet for approval. Printed budget books included performance reviews, income statements, proposed outlays, and annexures for new lines and rolling stock acquisition. These documents ran over 500 pages and were distributed to members of Parliament and the press. The day of the railway budget became a media event. Newspapers published special supplements, and announcements of new trains were eagerly anticipated by the public. In 2016, the railway budget was merged into the union budget to streamline financial planning and reduce redundancy. Yet, its legacy remains in the structured way Indian Railways plans and communicates its annual goals. Signage fonts and icon standards on Indian trains. Visual consistency was a priority in Indian Railways public-facing materials. Signage on coaches, platforms, and stations followed standardized fonts, iconography, and layout. Coach markings were required to display the train number, class designation, and destination. Lettering had to be at least 6 inches high, painted in white on a blue or maroon background, depending on the coach type. Platform signs included bilingual or trilingual text using Roman, Devanagari, and regional scripts. Pictograms for toilets, exits, and waiting areas were standardized using international symbols adapted for local use. Railway circulars specified font types, spacing, and placement. For example, train names had to be centered on the coach body, while the class code was to be placed in the top right corner of each door. Stickers inside coaches indicated safety procedures, emergency contact numbers, and luggage policies. These were laminated and affixed using railway approved adhesives. The move toward digital displays and LED boards began in the 2000s but followed the same layout principles. Consistency ensured clarity, especially for first time or non literate travelers. Train announcements, historical script evolution. Announcements on Indian railways have evolved from handheld megaphones to automated digital systems. In the early days, station staff used brass bells and shouted train information in local languages. Later, handheld microphones connected to station PA systems became standard. Scripts for announcements were written centrally and distributed to major stations. They included train number, name, platform number, and arrival departure time. Each announcement followed a rigid format to reduce confusion. For instance, passengers please note, train number 12,345, Howrah Rajdhani Express, is arriving on platform number 3 at 6:25 p.m. The same was repeated in Hindi, English, and the regional language. Voice artists were hired to record standardized audio files. Sala Chaudhary and Renu Mitra became iconic voices at stations like New Delhi and Howrah. These voices were instantly recognizable and are still fondly remembered. With computerization, announcements are now automated and synced with real-time data from train tracking systems. But the phrasing and cadence remain rooted in the original scripts, preserving a familiar auditory rhythm. Punctuality reports from 1970 to 2000. Between 1970 and 2000, Indian Railways invested significant resources into tracking and improving punctuality. Every division was required to submit monthly punctuality reports listing delays over 10 minutes, causes, and rectification steps. The data was compiled centrally and categorized under headings such as signal failure, rolling stock deficiency, track obstruction, or late arrival of link train. Each infraction was logged with precise timestamps and location codes. High priority trains like Rajdhani and Shatabdi were monitored more rigorously. Their performance was reviewed weekly at the zonal level. A delay of more than 15 minutes required a written explanation from the station master or train guard. Punctuality figures were also shared with Parliament through the railway budget annexures. Zones with low performance were subject to additional audits, and corrective action plans were implemented. Over time, the average punctuality of premium trains hovered around 85 to 90%, while ordinary passenger trains often fared lower. The Green Revolution's impact on rail freight. The Green Revolution of the 1960s and 1970s significantly altered freight patterns across Indian railways. With increased agricultural output, especially wheat and rice, there was a surge in demand for grain transport from Punjab, Haryana, and Uttar Pradesh to other parts of the country. Railways responded by introducing special grain rakes, dedicated freight trains composed entirely of covered wagons. These were scheduled during night hours to avoid congestion and ensured priority pathing on mainline routes. Freight rates were adjusted seasonally, and loading times at origin stations were optimized. Railway sidings were built, at Food Corporation of India FCY warehouses to streamline the logistics chain. Administrative procedures included weighbridge slips, gate passes, and revenue forms, all maintained as carbon copy triplicates. These documents were later digitized in the 1990s under the FOIS Freight Operations Information System. By the 1980s, agricultural freight accounted for over 30% of total rail cargo volume, and Indian Railways became a backbone of the national food distribution system. IRCTC and the digitization of tickets. The Indian Railway Catering and Tourism Corporation, IRCTC, was established in 1999 to modernize ticketing and passenger amenities. It began as a subsidiary of Indian Railways and gradually took over online reservations, tourism packages, and catering contracts. The online ticketing portal, irctc.co.in, launched in 2002. It allowed users to book tickets from home, eliminating the need for long queues at reservation counters. Transactions were logged through secure gateways with PNR numbers generated automatically. E-tickets featured QR codes, coach and berth details, and terms of travel. Conductors were equipped with handheld terminals to validate digital tickets. The back end integrated with CRIS databases to reflect real-time seat availability. IRCTC also handled Tatkal bookings, cancellation refunds, and dynamic pricing pilots. As demand grew, server capacity was upgraded multiple times to handle booking spikes during peak hours. Today, IRCTC manages not only tickets but also meals, rail tours, lounges, and even private train services, becoming a one-stop platform for railway passengers. Luxury trains, Palace on Wheels and beyond. Luxury train tourism in India began with the launch of the Palace on Wheels in 1982. Modeled after royal carriages used by former princely states, the train featured ornate interiors, onboard dining, and curated travel routes through Rajasthan. The train was a joint initiative between Indian Railways and the Rajasthan Tourism Development Corporation. It offered week-long journeys, stopping at cities like Jaipur, Udaipur, and Jaisalmer. Each coach was named after a princely state and decorated with region-specific artwork. Following its success, similar services were launched, including the Deccan Odyssey, Golden Chariot, and Maharaja's Express. These trains offered all-inclusive packages targeting international tourists with amenities like spas, bars, and conference rooms. Operational procedures for luxury trains were distinct. Dedicated tracks were cleared in advance, staff received hospitality training, and guests were welcomed with ceremonial rituals. Luxury tourism trains remain a niche offering, but are seen as a symbol of Indian heritage and hospitality on rails. The architecture of Indian railway stations. The architectural evolution of Indian railway stations reflects a mix of colonial legacy, regional aesthetics, and utilitarian design. Early stations, particularly those built in the mid to late 19th century, were often modeled after European Gothic revival or Indo-Saracenic styles. Terminals such as Victoria Terminus in Bombay now, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, featured pointed arches, stained glass, and stone carvings. These grand structures were intended to project imperial authority and architectural sophistication. Smaller stations in rural areas had simpler designs, gable roofs, brick walls, and iron columns holding up corrugated metal awnings. Wooden benches, mechanical clocks, and semaphore signal towers were standard. Post-independence, Indian Railways adopted a more functionalist approach. Stations built between the 1950s and 1980s emphasized concrete, tiled floors, and wide platforms. Architectural guidelines were issued to zonal offices to ensure standardization of waiting rooms, signage, and entry halls. In recent years, modernization has added escalators, glass facades, and digital boards, yet many stations retain their colonial era canopies and stone nameplates. Steam engines, how they worked. Steam locomotives, the backbone of Indian railways for over a century, were mechanical marvels driven by thermal expansion. Each engine had a firebox, boiler, pistons, and driving wheels. Coal or wood was loaded into the firebox by a fireman, where it was burned to heat water stored in the boiler. The boiling water created steam, which expanded and was channeled into cylinders containing pistons. The force of the steam moved the pistons back and forth, turning connecting rods attached to the driving wheels. This motion propelled the locomotive forward. The steam was then exhausted through a smokestack, creating the familiar chuffing sound. Operating a steam engine required a coordinated crew, a driver to manage speed and braking, a fireman to maintain pressure, and occasionally an assistant for route signaling. Maintenance routines were rigorous. Boilers had to be descaled regularly, valves adjusted, and bearings lubricated after each trip. Steam engines were also assigned specific sheds where they were cleaned, inspected, and prepared for their next duty. The story of railway mail services. Indian railways played a vital role in transporting mail across the subcontinent, linking distant towns with urban centers. Mail coaches were specially designated carriages, painted red and marked with the Indian Post's and Telegraph emblem. These coaches traveled attached to regular passenger trains. On board, postal clerks sorted letters and parcels mid-journey using collapsible sorting tables and canvas mailbags. Railway Mail Service RMS offices were located at major junctions. Here, mail was received, processed, and dispatched by rail to regional centers. A single letter could pass through multiple RMS units before reaching its destination. Trackside mail cranes were once used for high-speed mail exchange. A clerk would hang a bag on the crane, and a passing train's hook would grab it while simultaneously dropping another bag. This ensured mail could be delivered even if the train didn't stop. The system was phased out with the rise of airmail and digital communication, but RMS continued into the 2000s in many regions. The railway police and security forces. The protection of railway passengers, cargo, and property was formalized through the establishment of the Railway Protection Force, RPF, in 1957. Before the RPF, security duties were carried out by railway watchmen and constables appointed by regional administrations. These officers dealt with petty theft, fare evasion, and platform control. With growing passenger volume and freight traffic, a more structured force was required. The RPF was given powers to arrest, investigate, and prosecute offences related to railway property. Personnel were trained in crowd control, emergency response, and surveillance techniques. Uniforms consisted of khaki attire with red lanyards, later standardized to include caps and shoulder badges. Patrolling was conducted both on platforms and inside select trains, especially during festival seasons or peak travel months. In parallel, the Government Railway Police, GRP, handled crimes affecting passengers such as robbery or assault. GRP worked under state police jurisdiction, while RPF remained under the Ministry of Railways. Today, the two forces coordinate operations via shared databases and joint patrols. A day in the life of a station master, 1950s. At a typical Indian railway station in the 1950s, the station master played a pivotal role in daily operations. He arrived shortly before dawn, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, carrying a leather-bound logbook. His first task was to check the previous night's movement register, which trains arrived late, any cargo anomalies, and whether any signals malfunctioned. Next came the flagging off of early morning passenger trains. The station master walked to the platform with a green flag and a brass signal whistle. He waited for the guard's acknowledgement before authorizing departure. Throughout the day, he coordinated with nearby stations via telegraph, managed platform allocations, and oversaw ticketing staff, porters, and signalmen. He recorded every incident, delays, technical issues, lost property in a large ledger, maintained with meticulous handwriting. Lunch was usually taken in the station's back office, accompanied by the rhythmic sound of typewriters and distant whistles. If there was a VIP train or a scheduled inspection, preparations intensified. Platforms were swept, brass fittings polished, and uniform checks enforced. As night fell, the station master performed a final platform round, ensured signals were set to danger for the night, and handed over to the night shift officer. It was a life of routine, precision, and quiet authority. The evolution of railway catering in India. The story of food on Indian trains is as layered and aromatic as the meals themselves. In the earliest days of Indian railways, there were no formal arrangements for meals on long journeys. Passengers brought home-cooked food in tiffin carriers or purchased snacks from local vendors who sold items on platforms and through train windows. These early vendors sold puffed rice, boiled eggs, bananas, and fritters, often from small cane baskets. As long-distance travel increased, railway companies began organizing refreshment rooms at major junctions. These were contracted to private caterers, often European firms, who served tea, biscuits, and Western-style meals to first and second-class passengers. Third-class passengers, who made up the majority, continued to rely on vendors and their own provisions. By the mid-20th century, Indian Railways began managing catering operations directly. In 1955, the first pantry car was introduced on the Howrah-Kalka mail. These cars were equipped with coal-fired stoves, iron utensils, and compact food prep areas. The crew included cooks, assistants, and servers who moved between compartments delivering hot meals wrapped in foil and paper. The 1980s saw the formation of the Indian Railway Catering and Tourism Corporation, IRCTC, which standardized meal quality, introduced menu options, and implemented hygiene protocols. Trains like the Rajdhani and Shatabdi began serving full-course meals to passengers with items like dal, paneer curry, rice, roti, salad, and sweet dishes, all timed to each phase of the journey. Today, passengers can pre-order meals online, receive deliveries from partner restaurants en route, or choose from a rotating in-house menu. While some still miss the local vendors of old, railway catering has evolved into a vast, organized operation feeding millions each day. Mountain Railways of India, narrow tracks through the hills. India's mountain railways are feats of engineering that wind through rugged terrain, sharp curves, and steep gradients. They are not only functional transport systems, but UNESCO World Heritage Sites, preserving a bygone era of rail travel. The Darjeeling Himalayan Railway, built between 1879 and 1881, connects New Jalpaiguri to Darjeeling. This narrow gauge marvel climbs over 2,000 meters through forests and tea plantations. The line features the famous Batasya Loop, a spiral track that offers panoramic views of the mountains. Toy trains with small steam locomotives slowly chug along this line, echoing a century-old rhythm. In the south, the Nilgiri Mountain Railway links Mettupalayam to Udagamandalam, Ooty. This railway uses a rack and pinion system to manage the steep climb through the Nilgiris. Constructed by the British in the early 20th century, the train passes through tunnels, over bridges, and alongside waterfalls. The Kalka-Shimla Railway, opened in 1903, connects the Himalayan foothills with Shimla. With 103 tunnels, more than 800 bridges, and countless bends, the line was designed for both functionality and scenic pleasure. The coaches, painted in cream and red, are reminiscent of colonial times and often feature large windows for sightseeing. These mountain railways are slow, deliberate, and immersive, ideal for travelers seeking nostalgia rather than speed. They continue to operate as living museums, preserving the charm of India's early rail era. Signaling and communication, the language of the rails. In the complex world of railways, signaling is the silent language that prevents collisions and ensures smooth traffic flow. The Indian Railways signaling system has evolved from handheld lanterns to computerized automation. In the 19th century, signals were mechanical, semaphore arms mounted on tall posts that were raised or lowered to indicate stop or go. Station staff operated these manually based on train timetables and telegraph messages. Drivers observed the position of the arms to adjust speed or halt accordingly. Color light signals began replacing semaphores in the mid 20th century. These electric signals used red, yellow, and green lights, much like road signals, mounted on poles or gantries. Control was centralized in signal cabins, where operators switched tracks and signals using lever frames or electric panels. Communication between stations was initially managed by the Morse telegraph, followed by telephone exchanges, and later wireless radios. Today, trains are tracked in real time via satellite and control centers, which monitor routes across entire zones. The introduction of automatic block signaling and centralized traffic control has enabled Indian Railways to manage hundreds of trains simultaneously, even on the busiest corridors. Despite these advancements, traditional signal huts and lever rooms still exist in smaller stations, offering a glimpse into a more tactile era of rail control. Railway class evolution from imperial tiers to sleeper class. From the colonial era to the present day, the classification of passenger coaches in Indian Railways reflects a journey through social structure and accessibility. In the 19th century, there were generally three classes: first, second, and third. First class offered upholstered seats, fans, and sometimes sleeping berths, used mostly by British officials and elites. Second class was simpler, with wooden benches and shared compartments. Third class was the most basic: wooden planks for seats, minimal ventilation, and no reserved seating. It was intended for the vast majority of Indian passengers. Gandhi himself traveled in third class to protest the class-based inequalities of rail travel, using it as a symbol of solidarity with the common man. After independence, the system underwent changes. Second class was improved and designated as a more inclusive category. First class was retained but became rare and expensive. New categories emerged, including sleeper class, non air conditioned coaches with 3-tier berths and open windows, a C3 tier and a C2 tier, air conditioned coaches with sleeping berths and linen, a chair, car ki seat, for daytime travel with reclining seats, executive class and Vistadome coaches, newer luxury offerings for select routes. Today, the unreserved general class still exists, used by millions daily for short journeys. While comfort levels have risen, the class system continues to mirror economic diversity across India's vast population. Indian railways in Bollywood and literature. Trains have long captured the Indian imagination, serving as a metaphor for destiny, transformation, and migration in both film and literature. In Bollywood, trains often mark pivotal moments, farewells, reunions, escapes. Films like Sholay, Dil Se, and The Lunchbox feature iconic train scenes. The rhythmic clatter of wheels, the passing landscape, and the intimacy of a shared compartment have provided emotional backdrops for countless stories. In literature, railways appear in the works of R.K. Narayan, Ruskin Bond, and Kushwant Singh. Trains serve as places of introspection, cultural collision, and social observation. In Singh's Train to Pakistan, the rail becomes a haunting symbol of partition and displacement. Children's books like The Blue Umbrella and Rusty Runs Away use trains as settings for adventure and discovery. Poets have compared trains to serpents, lifelines, and dreams on rails. Railways continue to resonate because they represent movement of people, ideas, and time. Whether in celluloid or prose, they reflect a uniquely Indian sense of journey. You've just journeyed through nearly 2 centuries of quiet progress, steel, steam, schedules, and slow reform. As the final station approaches and the last page of this history closes, may your mind find rest, your breath grow softer, and your sleep come gently, like a night train, humming through the silence. If this journey brought you calm, consider subscribing or following for more quiet histories, told slowly, just like this. Thank you for listening. Good night.